George Symons. George Symons. I guess that's why the place is really packed. George returns today to the speaker's podium by public demand, really, as well as establishing himself as one of Queensland and Australia's most successful businessmen and clothing manufacturers. He's a polished musician, he's a talented artist, he's telling me to stop, and
don't stop.
And a great don't stop. Okay.
No, don't stop.
And a great storyteller. He's going to keep us interested and entertained today with stories of his migrant Greek heritage and origins. His topic is From My Grandpa's Greek Cafe to My Greek Tavern. Thanks, George.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'd like to thank Mr. Ross Garnett and Mr. Gerard Benjamin for inviting me here today. And secondly, I'd like to thank Mr. Ian Bates from ProCam Studios. They are the longest surviving production company in Queensland. They've been going over 31 years. And he's here today to do the filming for my daughters and grandchildren who are interstate and couldn't make it today. So, most importantly, thank you all for being here. I feel very privileged. I mean, it'd be terrible if I was here on my own. I once asked my dear friend, the late Colin Harper, conductor of the Queensland Pops Orchestra, what was the smallest audience he ever had? And he said to me that they were playing in a park in England once, and one person turned up. And they had to play the whole concert, and they found out later that he was the gardener. So I don't know if Colin was pulling my leg. I don't like people pulling my leg. Colin's very talented wife is here today. She plays the piano beautifully, is a mezzo-soprano, but I'm not going to embarrass her by asking her to sing. And I won't even mention her name or where she's sitting, but you look so lovely with those pearls on, Wendy Harper. Now, I've bought my gold bell along because, with no disrespect, sometimes my lovely wife nods off when I'm making a speech. She's a very interesting lady. She's bilingual, and when I embrace her, she says, "Ooh la la, ma chérie." Now, last year, I had the pleasure of speaking to you about our menswear business, the family on my father's side, George Symons Suits, and today we're speaking about my mother's side, the Mangos family, and Greek cafes, and my granddad's in particular. Now, my granddad came from the Greek island of Kastellorizo. His name was Michael Mangos, and all of my grandparents came from that island. And when Granddad was a young man, an uncle of his went back to Kastellorizo in 1909. He'd been living here for some years, and he invited Granddad, there he is as a young man, to live and work with him in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. So Granddad left his island and said goodbye to his family, and he was just 13 years of age. Now, Granddad worked with his uncle for 6 years and put all of the money he'd saved into his own cafe. And the First World War had broken out, and he'd only been in his cafe for 3 months when there were riots across the country, and 2,000 soldiers and civilians in Kalgoorlie alone smashed and looted the shops and the homes of anyone whose homeland was not an ally of Australia. And there's well, Greece was neutral at the time, but they hadn't declared their hand until 1917. So I've taken some photographs and some information from a book by Effie Alexakis and Leonard Januszewski, Greek Cafes and Milk Bars of Australia, and also from a charming lady here today, Her name is Tony Risson, and thank you for providing those extra pictures for us, Tony. Grandad got no compensation in Kalgoorlie. Am I too loud, darling? No. Yes, no, I know what I'm doing. Oh, yes, thank you. No, thank you, you're right. Tony Risson. Well done. That's Tony right there. Yeah. Oh. Now, Grandad, he got no compensation in Kalgoorlie, and without any money, he went and worked in Perth and Darwin for 2 years, and then to Innisfail. There he is in Innisfail. He's on the top left. He's in the top row, second from the left. And he worked in the cane fields. And there he is again in the top row, second from the left. And he said that he didn't fancy the venomous snakes in the cane fields, and several of his friends were bitten. Grandad hadn't seen his parents for 12 years, and in 1921 he went back to Castellorzo and to Port Said in Egypt for a very special reason, and this is why. He married my lovely grandma Anastasia, or Anastasia as we say. Now, it was a proxy wedding, and ladies and gentlemen, you know, when two families decide that their son and their daughter should marry, often the kids don't even know one another. And I mean, Wendy Harper, how would you feel if you didn't know me and your parents said to you, you have to marry that fellow?
I'd be thrilled.
I think this could be the start of something. I'm not going to ring that gold bell. Grandad brought his wife, his parents, a brother and a sister to Australia on a cargo ship that travelled for 40 days. And they're on the same deck as the animals because they had no refrigeration, and the animals there to feed the people. And Grandma was sick every day on the boat, the poor thing. Mind you, she got sick in the bathtub. You know, seasick, that is. Now, in Melbourne, Grandad and his 4 brothers opened the Oriental Oyster Cafe in Windsor, and they sold fresh oysters, bottled oysters, cooked oysters. And here's a photograph of the 4 brothers, but unfortunately I don't have one of them when they were young. And eventually the brothers had their own businesses, and Grandad changed the name of his shop to the Mangos Oyster Cafe. That's his menu up there, at 54 Chapel Street, Windsor. And the record for eating oysters, and I like them, but this story makes me feel a little bit funny in the tummy. A fellow came in one day and he ordered a dozen, then he had 2, 3, 4. He finished at 9 dozen oysters he ate in one sitting. Well, Grandad's menu had no Greek food on it. And he made the most lovely avrolemono soup. You know what that is, Anna? Egg and lemon soup, but it wasn't on the menu. In fact, we have the recipe, and if all of you lovely people would like to come home this afternoon and have some avrolemono soup, darling, could you get about 160, no. Well, it was the Depression of 1930, and people were actually coming in to Grandma and Grandad's place begging for food. They were so hungry, and Grandad and Grandma couldn't say no. So they had tough times. The reason so many Greeks went into cafes was because they didn't need a profession or a trade or even a high standard of education, but they needed to provide good food at reasonable prices with good service and friendliness, and they did. So the majority of Grandad's customers came in after what they called the 6 o'clock swill, and they'd stagger down Chapel Street and one drunk went into the kitchen and he was being difficult, and my uncle had to actually physically push him out, and he came back in and he threatened to seat Uncle Con on the hot plate. But there was a waitress who liked my Uncle Con a lot, and she donged the fellow over the head with a frying pan and he didn't come back. My family worked so hard, they peeled thousands of potatoes by hand. You remember the old order, piece of flake and 6 of chips. Flake was actually shark. And one day a man came into the cafe and he had this big machine, I remember it was round with jagged edges, and you put the spuds in and press the button and it spun, and minutes later the potatoes were all peeled. Voila. So nearly every country town had a Greek cafe, and they frequently helped out the farmers in bad times in the rural areas. That's a difficult word to say, isn't it? Rural. Now Gerard Benjamin, he's a wordsmith. Where are you, Gerard? Put your hand up, would you? Would you be so kind as to say rural 4 times fast? Out loud.
Rural, 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 rural.
No, he's too good. Often people drove into country towns at night when the hotel kitchens were closed, but there was always the Greek cafe to provide hot fish and chips or a mixed grill. They worked very long hours. Some opened between 6 and 7 in the morning and didn't close until 11 to 12 at night. Here's a cafe in a town called Batlow in New South Wales, and they opened, well, actually they were trading in 1940, and it said meals all hours. I don't know if you can see that there. And here's another one. The Britannia Cafe opened in 1914 in Hobart in Tasmania, and once again, meals at all hours. Now, my Uncle Con at the Canis Cafe Richmond, where the sign says, the proprietor of this establishment is a naturalised British subject formerly of Greek nationality, and that was to prevent racial discrimination. So here's one, the Boomerang Cafe from Silwood in Queensland, and that gentleman in the white singlet, I think he's had too many baklavas. And here is a sketch by Russell Drysdale from 1950. I think this bloke has had a few baklavas too. One Greek gentleman opened his first cafe in 1894 opposite the Melbourne Town Hall, and eventually he had the Cafe Vienna, and it was described as the most beautiful cafe in the Southern Hemisphere. Have a look at that. Some cafe, huh? When my relations weren't working at the shop, they used to go on picnics. There's Grandad on the left again in the bottom row. And if they weren't in the country, they would go to Hampton Beach. Granddad's only other recreation was bowls. He used to go to the Paran Bowls Club, and I remember he'd get dressed up in his whites and he'd very proudly walk down the street from the home. And I remember Grandma yelling out to him once, "You don't limp when you go to bowls, do you, Mick?" Grandad was a magistrate, and when he had an operation on his hips, a get well card came from the Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, so Grandad was a very well respected man. Grandad and Grandma had 6 children, and my mother was the first. Isn't she lovely? Yeah. And Mum's brothers and sisters came along. Here they are. And on the left is the youngest Jackie. And then, I've got a light here, haven't I? That's Jackie. And that's Chrissy. And that's Peter, who did medicine. And that's Cherry Mangos. And the kids at school used to call her Cherry Mango. A very fruity woman, they said. That's my Uncle Con, who's still with us. 93, and that's my lovely mother. So it was the dream of every Greek cafe owner to provide a future for their children, and not necessarily in cafes. They wanted their children to go to secondary school, to college, and to university, as most of the cafe owners didn't have the opportunity to go beyond primary school. Mum and all of her brothers and sisters worked at the Mangos Cafe at some time or another, and they had a phone link from the cafe to the shop. And when they were very busy in the cafe, they just used to say shop, and whoever was at home used to come running around to help. And it was difficult for Uncle Peter because he was studying medicine at the time, and he matriculated, and here he is with Grandad and Grandma, and he went to England for his FRCS, the Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and then at one time he was in Vietnam helping our soldiers, and he was the doctor for the Sydney Swans football team for 17 years and saw them win 2 grand finals. One of Mum's cousins, Connie Mangos, opened a cafe called the Excel Cafe in Elizabeth Street, Melbourne, and that gave his son John the opportunity to do journalism and television. That's Johnny on the right, my cousin. And he got his big break on a show called Coast to Coast with Graham Kennedy. How am I going, darling? All right? Yeah. Mum's brother, Uncle Con, also had the opportunity to get out of cafes, and he bought a shop called McAllister's Liquor Store. And he played cricket for the Olympic team, and he was said to be the slowest leg spin bowler of all times. He said that he took a lot of wickets because the batsman fell asleep waiting for the delivery. Uncle Connie has the most wonderful sense of humour. My father, when he was getting old, he said to Con, look, I'm worried I might have to relinquish my driver's licence because I can see straight ahead and I can see to the left, but I can't see anything to the right. And Con said, well, just keep turning left. He said, you'll never get lost and you'll get to know all your neighbours. Some very funny things happened at that cafe. Now, this is my Uncle Jackie, and one day, he was the youngest, one day Uncle Jackie and Uncle Peter, who looked very much alike, were behind the counter. And Uncle Jackie bent down to get something from the fridge, and a woman came in and placed an order. And she saw Uncle Peter go up to the kitchen, but she didn't see Jackie behind the counter. So she bent down and was foraging around in her handbag, and when she looked up, Jackie was there. She said, how'd you do that? He said, what? She said, well, I saw you go up to the kitchen. He said, no, I didn't. He said, what would you like? So she gave him the order again. And he went up to the kitchen, and just after he went into the kitchen, Uncle Peter came out. And when Uncle Peter came out with her order, she said, how did you do that? I think she's still having therapy. Anyway, once a drunk came into the cafe and he ordered fried eggs on toast, and he was really drunk, and he's sitting there looking at his food, and he went, "Broop," and he face first into the eggs, and Uncle Con raced over and grabbed him by the hair and pulled him. I mean, he could have suffocated, you know. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a poor joke, but that's really having egg on your face, isn't it? Oh. My favourite story from the Mangos Cafe, and there are many funny stories. After Grandma's sister died, her husband, Uncle John, didn't know what to do with himself, and he thought he was helping when he came into the kitchen on busy nights, but he was really a nuisance but they didn't have the heart to tell him. Anyway, one day a fellow ordered steak and oyster sauce, and Uncle John prepared it and gave it to him, and then the man called my granddad over to his table and he said, Mick, I've been coming here for 19 years, that's the worst meal I've ever had. He said, what did you have? He said, I had steak and oyster sauce. And what had happened, in the kitchen, they had a bowl of milk for putting the oysters in, and a little further up on the bench, they had paint for painting the specials on the window. And Uncle John had mixed the oysters with the white paint and poured it over the man's steak, and he ate it. And I don't know what happened when he went to the toilet. Anyway, in the countryside, the Greek cafes were at the height of their popularity from the late 20s until the early 60s. Is that right, Tony Risson? Where are you? Oh yeah, is that right, darling? That's right, yeah. And they were part of the identity and social fabric of the community. If you wanted to catch up on the local news, you'd meet your friends at the Greek cafe. The owners knew everybody and they made you feel at home. It was like everyone was part of a large extended family. But in the late 60s, they began to decline with the advent of television, movie theatres closing down, hotels serving food and staying open until 9 o'clock. So there was no more 6 o'clock swill, that was gone. And then supermarkets were selling ice cream and confectionery. So getting towards the end of the Mangos Cafe days, Uncle Jackie was tired of hearing Mrs. Goldstein say, "I'm wanting to buy that fish in the window, but is it fresh?" And Uncle Jackie would say, "Yes, Mrs. Goldstein, it's fresh." And he'd worked for many, many years and the shop was about to close, and she came in one day and she said, "I am wanting to buy that fish in the window, but is it fresh?" And Uncle Jackie said, "Well, not really." And she said, "What do you mean not really?" And he said, "Well, if it was really fresh, it would be swimming." Grandad closed the famous Mangos Cafe in 1972 after 42 years of trade. Long time. On average, restaurants close, 80% of restaurants close after 2 or 3 years, and they kept going for 42. And shortly after, I opened Brisbane's first Greek taverna. And I called it... Now, yeah, but which one are you whistling? Now, on the left is a man called Theo Patrick, in the middle Spiros Levanis, and that's myself on the right. And Spiro was the catering manager of the Melbourne Hotel when I went to him and said, "I want to open Brisbane's first Greek taverna, will you join me?" He said, "Yes, providing I can bring Theo." So we started. And because our families were for different islands, we called it Taverna Tanissia, which means Tavern of the Islands. But the Aussies thought it was Tunisia, as in Africa. So I changed the name. And there's my staff in the restaurant, of course. And yeah, do you know some of these people? Yeah, you do, Anna, don't you? Because Anna, the lovely Anna sitting here in the front row, she was my secretary for a long time.
And I was a customer.
Yeah, and Anna was a customer. Now there's my menu. The Greek club the Greek club had Greek food, of course, but restaurants, to my knowledge, didn't have any. And so we were very Greek, and there's that lovely avrolemono soup, the first one under soups. Now, at 85 years of age, Grandad took my mother and her sisters to Castellorizo. He hadn't been to his island for 60 years. And when he got there, an old girlfriend wanted to reignite the flame. But he didn't think that was such a good idea because his heart was a bit dicky, you know. I said goodbye to my wonderful grandfather when he was 95 at the nursing home. And that's Uncle Peter, the doctor, in the middle of the picture. And that's my Uncle Connie on the right, sporting the baldy spot. All of my family, all the men have got baldy spots. And Grandad had very bad circulation in one of his legs. And the doctors told him that he'd have to have it amputated. And he would have been in terrible pain. Unfortunately, I know from experience. But God intervened, and Grandad passed away in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. So it was a good farewell. He was a lovely man. He was very quiet, but he was always happy. He hardly ever spoke. I only ever heard him criticise one person. The family were in the lounge room once and they were talking about different people, and this fellow's name came up, who was a real skite. And he was always talking about his great achievements, you know. And Grandad said, "He's full of bullshit, that fella." It was the only time I ever heard him say it. Anyway, oh, and another thing too. Grandad Michael and Grandad George Symons were together once with me, just the three of us. And I was only about 4 or 5 years of age, and I was being particularly mischievous. And my grandfather George, who was quite a serious man, said, "He's going to be a criminal, lad boy." and my grandfather Michael said, "He's nuts, that kid." Well, I didn't turn out to be a criminal, so one of them was wrong. Well, sadly, there aren't many Greek cafes left. And when we lose one, we lose part of the character of our country towns. But although they are rapidly fading from our culinary landscape, its cultural legacy and influence remain, almost inescapably, as part of the lives of many Australians because after all, almost every Australian has a Greek friend. And if any of you lovely people don't have a Greek friend, I'll be your friend. But it's on one condition. You've heard that expression, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, haven't you? Well, I need a babysitter for when my grandchildren are all together, right? And before I ask for a volunteer to babysit, I think it's only fair to show you a photo of my grandchildren. Now, yesterday I went and got some freshly made Greek biscuits for us. So we'll have afterwards with our tea and coffee, and they're great for dunking. And I'm only charging $50 each for them. No, they'll be with my compliments. So enjoy them, please. Now, I spoke earlier of the lovely Toni Risson. She wrote books on Greek cafes, Aphrodite in the Mixed Grill, Greek cafes, and A Million Molten Milks. And she's here today, of course, and she'll speak a little later, but I want to tell you, before Toni speaks, my 3 favourite naughty but quick Greek cafe jokes, okay? There was an Australian health inspector, Mr. Jones, and he went into a Greek cafe and he said to the owner, "I'm here to conduct a health survey, mate, and I want to know how you get your fish from the kitchen to the window. You're very pleased you asked me this one. What I do, I always use the stainless steel tongs. I never touch anything with my hands. Very hygienic in this cafe." "Good, mate. What about sliced bread and tomato and stuff like that?" "Always the stainless steel tongs. Never touch anything with my hands." I said, "Okay." He said, "But before I go, I notice when I come in you got a bit of string on your fly. What's that for?" And the Greek cafe owner said, "Well, I go to the toilet, I just pull down the string and she comes out, and I don't have to touch anything with my hands." And Mr. Jones said, "Yeah, but how do you redress yourself?" He said, "With the stainless steel tongs." There were two truck drivers going along a big highway, and they stopped at a Greek cafe. And one said, "I'll have a hamburger, thanks, love." And the other fella said, "I'll have a Frankfurt." And the woman got the hamburger mince out and she put her under her arm. And the fella said, "What are you doing with my hamburger mince?" And she said, "Well, the microwave oven broke down, so I'm thawing it out." And the other fella said, "Cancel my Frankfurt." There was a woman at West End that used to grow vegetables for her family cafe, but she couldn't make her tomatoes grow. And the fella next door, he had big, beautiful red tomatoes. And she was a shy woman, but she couldn't help herself. And one day, when she saw him over the fence, she said, "Excuse me, Mr. Smith." She said, "But why is it that you got beautiful tomatoes and mine are small like this? I water them, I fertilize them. They don't change." But he said, "Listen, love, Maria, if I tell you what I do, you mustn't tell anybody, right? It's our secret." She said, "All right." He said, "Every morning I go down at the crack of dawn and I show them my private part and they swell and get red with embarrassment. If you do the same thing, you'll have good tomatoes." So a week later, he saw her over the fence and he said, "Hey Maria, how are your tomatoes going?" She said, "No change whatsoever. I do what you tell me every morning, but my God, you should see the size of my cucumbers." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like, before I ask Tony to come up, I'd like to read you a poem that I wrote, and I called it "Being a Grozzy." And the reason I use the word grozzy is because it's a Greek Aussie poem, and the word "skip" in the poem, it means when a Greek boy or girl marries an Australian, affectionately they call them their skips, which is from Skippy the Bush Kangaroo, you see. So I'm going to read this poem to you now, and I'm going to ask the lovely Odette to come up here and just keep an eye on the poetry in case I make any mistakes. And Odette's been with me for 30 years, and I think she deserves a little round of applause, don't you? You stand over here. Yeah, there it is. I wasn't serious about the soups, by the way.
Do you want to change the slide?
Sorry?
You want to change the slide?
Oh, yes. There we are. Talking of Greece. Voila. Castellorizo. Well, being a grozzy. Well, you don't know if you're special or you're sort of like a geek when your mum and dad are Aussies, but they say we're really Greek. As a babe of Greek extraction, whilst on my mother's breast, I had a milky feeling that I wasn't like the rest, because Grandad said we civilised the Western world, you see. We introduced democracy, we taught philosophy, Olympic Games and medicine, and last but no means least, anything of any worth, its origin was Greece. And if the Aussies can't pronounce your name like Papatanasopoulos, an Anglo-Saxon papas is accepted by the populace. But when I went to primary school, all the kids were fair. The football team had freckles with a mop of golden hair. Mum said, "We don't have freckles. Our olive skin is soft, and if you ever get one, it'll probably slip off." My hair was black as black. My eyes were chocolate brown. The only continental on the southern side of town, I wasn't like the other kids. So I just had to wait for no discrimination of a new Hellenic mate. And don't think it was easy with a calamari lunch. And Johnny Smith unknowingly said, "Hey, can I have a munch?" And before he saw the tentacles, I tell you what I did. I said, "You've just consumed about a half a pound of squid." "Half a pound of what?" He said, "Dad uses that for bait." I had a sinking feeling I was losing me a mate, and then his eyes protruded, his face a ghostly white. Regurgitated squid, my friends, it's not a pretty sight. Then in my teens, my body said that soon I'd be a man with the very first arousal of my seminary gland. But they say you could go cross-eyed by pretending you're a man when you contemplate the act of fornication. Sex was terrifying, so my last considered tactic was experimental intercourse without a prophylactic. Virginity was sacrosanct till time to procreate. The Greek girls were all virgins, how could I tell my mates? My purity was sickening, and added to my woes, no undulating features from my forehead to my nose. Like a bloomin' statue, one straight line. The profile of Dionysus, the Grecian god of wine. I wished I was an Aussie to be just like the rest. And then I grew this massive hair here on my puny chest. Then father said, "Hey Yorgos, now that you're a man, it's time to give us grandchildren, and marriage is the plan. A young girl from our village, 2 lovely golden teeth, We've done the proxenia, my boy. To you she is bequeathed. Her Christian name's Maria. Her surname Papamilos. Don't be discouraged by her weight. She's 97 kilos and she has a little problem. She's only 4'8". She didn't do too well at school, but you'll appreciate that our culture is exemplary. You do not want contrition. The most important value is a woman's disposition. Don't look so acrimonious as if to show remorse. To choose a woman for your life, it's like you pick a horse. Contemplate the breeding. Is she from good stock? With subservient devotion, you'll be solid as a rock. Well, I fed ink and bolted and I married me a skip. And for all you younger grozies, hear my philosophic tip. Be proud of our hereditary, but marry who you will, and hopefully she's got a quid and she can pay the bills. Tony. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you most sincerely. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Good. I think we just witnessed a masterclass in how to hold an audience in your hand. Very well. George, don't take the microphone off George yet, because I'm going to ask if there are any questions.
How long did Taverna keep going?
I think it went for 15 years. Yeah. But there's only one thing worse than Alzheimer's. I've told you before, it's George Symons. So I think it's 12. Yes, Ophelia?
George?
Well, I went to school with this guy.
No, many moons ago. I'll come to that in a second. I hear you praising Castellorizo.
Ella.
And when you mentioned the three islands, Spiro, Theo and yourself,
Yeah.
you failed to mention Tito.
We were there last month.
Oh, really? Tony's been there and Franklin should have been there with us.
Well, when I say we were there, we were almost ready to...
You should be speaking up for Kithera too, right? Otherwise your dad is rolling over his grave. Secondly, George, you obviously did listen to the English teachers at Brisbane State High School in 1962.
62... don't.
And I compliment you on the fact that it might have been Tom Kelly or...
Billy Beckman? English teacher. I didn't have one. It wasn't Billy Beckman, he was our chemistry teacher. No, I don't.
Who was the English teacher?
I don't remember.
No, not George.
No, I don't know.
Anyway, congratulations, George, and well done.
Caristo. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear a big round of applause for Toni Risson. Here she comes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction, George. I don't know if anyone else has heard this, but I heard that if you've got a bald spot on the top of your head, that's an indication that you're a good lover.
Yeah? Mine's only small.
I've also heard that if you're missing hair from this area, you're a good thinker. But if you're missing hair from this area and this area, you think you're a good lover. It's just what I've heard. You mightn't be right. You might be tempted to think that some of the things you've heard today, all these very tall stories, are George's imagination running wild. Stories about cucumbers and frankfurts aside, I can, after 15 years of research, tell you that these stories are all true, and these stories are all very typical of the stories of people who had Greek cafes. But thank you very much for the opportunity to just come very briefly and emphasise the importance of the story that George has told us. This is a peculiarly Australian phenomenon, and it's an amazing phenomenon. And the more that I know about Greek cafes, the more amazed I am by the fact of them and all the stories surrounding them. From one shop, run by a Catherian, yes, Victor, in 1888 in Sydney, it's a Commoner family that opened that shop. From that one shop, Greek cafes spread across Australia, particularly concentrated in the eastern states. Every town had a Greek cafe, every little town. Bigger towns like Ipswich and Toowoomba, you're looking at 10 to 15, maybe up to 20 or 25 over the century. They were open all the time. I've had lots of stories of people who had meals at all hours over their shop fronts. When a train would get into Monto, say, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the proprietor's asleep, but the travellers just get off the train, knock on the door, he would get up, stoke the stove, make them a mixed grill. So they were open all the time. The menu was the same countrywide. The food was cheap, there were big servings of it. They really were much like McDonald's is today, except for one thing. McDonald's is a sterile, multinational organisation. These shops were run by families, and they were run by families that were in the centre of that town sometimes for 50 years. It's absolutely astounding Australian phenomenon. So very delighted to hear George's first-hand account of his families today. The extent of this story, really we're only starting to understand it now, because until probably the turn of the century, nobody thought about Greek cafes. But that's when we realised we were losing them in big numbers. There's almost none left now. And over the time that I've been researching them, so many of those, the first proprietors were probably already gone before I started to be interested. So many of the next generation has gone. So George as a grandson, as that third generation, he's like the youngest of the people who've still got these stories. Because what I'm finding is that people of that third generation do not even know their granddad had a Greek cafe. So we're losing these stories, and we're losing them fast. That's why I'm very delighted to tell you that the State Library is doing an exhibition about Greek cafes, which is a major recognition of the importance of this story, not just to Australia, but to the Greek migrant population. We've been working on it since late last year. It opens in late September, and out there on the table, I'll make sure there's lots of little fridge magnets and postcards. Please take one home, because I want you all to come. I'm personally inviting you all. That first Sunday, which will be the last Sunday in September, it's an open house. We'll have lots of things happening, and I hope you'll all try and make it. But it's a free exhibition, and it runs for 6 months, so lots of opportunity. I met George about 3 years ago when I had won a fellowship to work at the State Library, and that project was just to look at Greek cafes in Brisbane. And what I discovered was the extent of the phenomenon just in Brisbane was that by 1925 there were 72 Greek cafes. And I'm working with the library now on a map where we're just going to put little pinpoints on every cafe, and I expect that map to be, those inner city blocks to be covered with little spots. So during that project resulted in this book that George was talking about, published by Teacup Books, and it will tell stories about Christie's, the Astoria, the Zebra Cafe up near Roma Street, a whole lot of different shops right across Brisbane.
Oh, that's good.
So if you'd like a copy of that, we've got some outside today. But make sure you do get one of these to remind you about the exhibition. I'll leave you just with a little story, one that's in this book. I want to take you back, and I want to take you out of here. Imagine the mall, Queen Street Mall. Let's go to, you know where Hungry Jack's is now, on the corner of Albert and Queen Street? Go 2 doors up. There's a bank, a major bank has just gone into that shop. But that shop has been in the Paddy family for 103 years. So go back to the early 30s, major renovation, flash shops opened, it's called the Cafe Pacific. Downstairs in the basement, massive big new stove, kitchen pumping out massive numbers of mixed grills and all other sorts of things. 2 levels of dining, a special part where only people who were accompanied by a lady could go. So this was a real shift from the blokey sort of oyster saloon to a refined family establishment. On the top of this building, that's where we keep all the livestock. There are chooks up there, there are turtles up there because turtle soup's really popular. There's a big refrigeration area up there, so when they're cleaning the fish, that goes into the refrigeration area. The chooks are dispatched, plucked into the refrigeration area. It's a massive amount of work going on at every level of this shop. And one of my favourite stories is of Victor's cousin Peter as a little boy being responsible for feeding the turtles, because obviously they would be there for a while until it came their turn to become turtle soup. And while he's feeding them lettuce as a little boy, looking across at the town hall clock in the next block, he's riding these big turtles across the top of that building. And I just think that whole image is so far removed from the way we think about our world now. I love these stories. I love the Greek people that I've met, people like the Paddy family and George, of course, whose story is in the book. And it's been such a privilege to be part of documenting this history. It's a really important story and we are losing it. So if you're Greek or if you've got Greek friends, please tell them the library is so interested in hearing your stories and interested in taking care for the rest of time of those things that will document that story. I can't tell you how often I've had people say, oh, when Yaya died, we didn't know what that stuff was, went to the dump. So sad. But thank you again for letting me come, and thank you for regaling us with that wonderful tale, George.